Hello and welcome back to the Pave the Way podcast, a joint initiative with Rahagiri Foundation and the National Institute of Urban Affairs, where I, your host Akash Basu, speak with mobility experts and people from around the globe on all kinds of issues and ideas surrounding sustainable mobility and transport planning. On today's episode, I am joined by Stephen Draexler. Usually I introduce our guests, but I think it would be best if Stephen introduces himself for this one. So, welcome to the podcast, and we're really happy to have you on.
Thanks, Akash. My name is Stephen Draexler, and my introduction might be a bit longer. So I'm from the German International Corporation, GIZ, and I'm working on a project right now that is called the NDC Transport Initiative for Asia. We are a regional Asian project funded by the German federal government, and we're working on decarbonising transport. So we're working together with partners from India, from Vietnam, from China, Thailand and the Philippines, and trying to implement or support policy making in those countries and cooperating closely with our partner ministries and institutions in the countries, so to say. Yeah. So thanks for having me. Yeah.
Absolutely, lovely to have you on. So you mentioned decarbonizing transport as your main field of work. I think it's good to start there. How important is it to decarbonize transport when we talk about how we need to tackle climate change? To what extent is like vehicular pollution and transport contributing to climate change, and how important is it for us to tackle it?
Great. So maybe starting with the question, why decarbonizing transport or decarbonizing in general is so important. I think there are two main issues. You mentioned one, climate change, definitely. So we're running into a huge problem right now and need to do something to counter it. That's on the one side, why decarbonizing is important. And on the other side, it's also a question of life quality, of life, of polluted inner cities, pollution in general. So these two things we're trying to tackle, and transport is one of the major levers to this, or one of the hard nuts to crack in this regard. So transport emissions have been growing and are growing continuously, even if we have many efforts in many countries around the globe trying to tackle this, but it's a very difficult area because we are so, let's say, fossil fuel addicted in this area. And other solutions, of course, we'll be talking about electric vehicles and other sustainable transport modes are popping up, but it's just very difficult to implement because we're so used to our, let's say, current solutions we're using. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Maybe this initially to address your question. Yeah.
So is it this dependence on vehicles? There are cities around the world that seem to have done a pretty good job of reducing that dependence. Of course, we look at places like Amsterdam in the Netherlands and Paris and France, and I'm guessing Germany also, I have not been, not recently anyways, has much more sustainable mobility options. So why is it so much more difficult in certain Asian countries? Because in India it seems like our car dependence sometimes feels impossible to fight. There's probably a demand, but we can't see it because cars seem to dominate our streets. So how do we, is it just car dependence, and how do we go about reducing that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So I think that's also the struggle or difficulty in terms of tackling this globally, because every country, every culture is different. And now, as you mentioned, India being car dependent, I think if we look at the ratio between population and vehicles on the road, we would say, compared to other countries, India is not so car dependent. So you've got a lot of cyclists, let's say a lot of two-wheelers, three-wheelers. And for example, our numbers in Germany, we will have one vehicle on the road per, let's say, 1.5 people in Germany. So roughly, I don't have the exact number right now, but it's roughly 50 million cars for 80 million people. And in India, this number is much less. It's probably 100 to 200 million cars, and you're 1.5 billion in population nearly. So the car dependency, I think, in India is there in major cities. We see a lot of congestion, but the car ownership is relatively low globally. So I think comparing Europe to India in that terms is quite difficult, because I think the ramp up in vehicles in India is to come still. So economy is growing, there's more purchasing power. So in India, the question would be more how to maybe avoid a further very strong ramp up. And in Germany, for example, our question is how can we reduce our vehicle stock? How can we get to less vehicles per person? So I wouldn't say that India in that terms is doing it worse, or it's just a different situation you have to tackle right now, right? So that would be the key thing I want to point out. And talking about the vehicle, I wouldn't see the vehicle as such as an enemy. It's just this the ownership and the status symbol of a vehicle. I think this mindset needs to change, because of course the technology is great if we think about it. If it wasn't polluting and we wouldn't have congestions and health issues in cities and pollution, the vehicle would be a great thing, right? But we have these issues, and how can we move maybe away from this status symbol of a vehicle, of owning a personal vehicle, to something that's maybe even nicer for everyone?
Seems very tough to do that, but yeah. So you had mentioned obviously electric mobility and shared mobility, and I think that is one of your main areas of expertise. So in your opinion, to what extent is electric mobility the future, and going to be the one thing that does help tackle the climate crisis, whilst also because people have a desire for vehicles. People want to drive. Even if we get rid of some chunk of cars, loads of people are still going to be driving their vehicles. So to what extent is electric mobility the solution to this?
So electric mobility is definitely one of the solutions, yeah. So as I was mentioning, in like the ideal transport system of the future, we'll have some vehicles, right? We want to, of course, move away from owning vehicles, but we will have vehicles in the system. And if we have electric vehicles that are ideally also shared, I'll come to that point in a moment, and fueled or charged by renewable energy, then we'll really manage to reduce emissions to hopefully also net zero in the end. But they are an important part, but it's always, let's say, the sexy idea to think, okay, if we implement this nice technology, it will get rid of all the problems we have, but it won't be that way. It's part of the solution, but not the whole package, yeah.
So let's form the whole package. Of course, electric mobility becomes a part of it. How, what are some other components of that package that we need to, move towards a more sustainable future?
So maybe starting at the very top, I would suggest, or research suggests, that we should try to decrease the total amount of kilometers traveled per person. So I think this idea to just reduce emissions first is through distance as well. We don't need commuters commuting 50 kilometers a day. That the city planning, and this is a long process as well, it can't be done overnight, needs to really look for people being able to live, work and spend their time without long distance of commuting. Maybe there's these projects on 15-minute cities, right, where you can live, work and spend your spare time, free time, do your chores in let's say a 15-minute radius without having to commute these long distances. And this already lowers emissions, pollution, less congestion and so on, and is also more livable. So starting at the top, this would be one of the ideas. Then of course, if we go in that direction, cycling and walking will be much easier to be done, right? Because you don't need to go these long distances where you might need a vehicle, a train or so ever, right? So this would be the second step. Then of course, for the kilometers we can't travel by walking or cycling, public transport would be the best thing, or shared transport. I don't know how it will look in the future, because there are a lot of interesting ideas, also software based, on how to really increase the shareage of vehicles. Because an example in Germany, we call a vehicle Fahrzeug, which means driving thing. But what we see in Germany is that these vehicles are mostly parked for like maybe 90% of the day. So it should be a parking thing, not a driving thing. And this has to change. So if we're talking about, let's say, 50 million cars in Germany that are used 80% of the day, these could be reduced by a large number then, if we would be sharing these cars. We would only need, what would the calculus be? Maybe 20% of the cars. Huh? if they're shared. So this would be the next level, and then of course the vehicles that are running, let's say public transport, be it private owned cars or shared cars, let's say shared cars, they should be electric in urban settings. And then I think the big discussion, if we're talking about not only about people moving and transport, we need to talk about freight as well. And I think urban freight is also very clear. We need to electrify it, cleanest solution. And then for long distance, very strenuous routes, then there's still a discussion on which technology should be used. I think freight is still a discussion how we will do that. Long haul, heavy duty freight is a big discussion at the moment still. Yeah.
I think that was really, really well put, which is start at the hyperlocality, the 15-minute cities, and then look at shared mobility, and then personal mobility should be electric vehicles. That seems like a great way forward. You've worked in a lot of countries around Asia, even Germany. The concept of hyperlocality, 15-minute cities is very intriguing. Do you think it's implementable pretty much everywhere? In the countries you work, do you think it can be implemented in almost all of them, or will some need a lot more work to create those 15-minute neighborhoods?
Well, that's an excellent question. So as I mentioned, it's a long-term change we need. So we've had this terrible corona pandemic, of course, COVID pandemic, which has been terrible, but what it has shown us as well is that remote working in Europe, this has been the big change. I'm not quite aware how this was in India before the pandemic, but in Europe it has shown us that we don't need to travel that much, that a lot of remote working can also be done. So this is, for example, one example what can change and also reduce travel. But creating these 15-minute cities, of course, is not only about working remotely, but is also has a lot to do with planning of the cities and where you locate work, where you locate your, let's say, grocery stores, your doctors, your schools. So, but I think, as you may know, like changing infrastructures in city, that takes a long time. But I think it's also, there can be a lot of change done by the population as such as well, saying, okay, hey, I will try to move maybe closer to my employer. But then again, that's also a difficult thing to do, but just the consciousness of people as well. Hey, do I really need to always travel all this way to do this and that, or will I just maybe try to find a solution within my neighborhood? But mentioned again, I think the city planners, governments also need to be aware of this. Yeah. So I think, coming back to your question, this was a long talk for getting to the point. Actually, it takes a long time, but I hope that also city planners, I think, are aware of this more or less. It's costly to implement, but if the population, citizens demand this and want this, and let's say vote for this, then change can be done. But of course, I'm coming back to the examples Amsterdam, Copenhagen, smaller cities, easier to be done and less densely populated than in India. Easier to be done than maybe cities like Mumbai or Delhi, where the population and density is very, very high. So needs complete replanning or other approaches.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you said, which is what all of our guests have always said, which is this: the change will take a lot of time. Patience is required. You have to be accepting that it is gradual change that will bring about big change, but it will take a long time. Obviously creating hyper-localized cities is going to take years and years and years, but it's important to stick with the process. Moving forward, I guess I'd ask, you have worked in so many countries. What are some of the initiatives, let's say, taken in, because you worked extensively in Asia, what are some of the initiatives or changes that you've seen that, are really positive that maybe other countries which currently are not doing too well on the sustainable mobility spectrum could learn from?
So I think it's all about having the courage to implement measures that in a first line might face resistance, but in the long run will be healthier and nicer and more sustainable to have for the population. So we're talking about maybe zero emission zones, saying, okay, city center is only available to either electric vehicles or cycling or walking or metro, stuff like that. banning maybe polluting cars from city centers. Stuff like that. On the short run, people will be complaining probably a lot because they can't reach where they used to reach by car, and they have to change their mindset. But once this is implemented, then they'll reap the benefits, because they'll see city center. Of course, talking about city center in Delhi, that's probably a huge part, but if you just look for specific zones, which could be like the first test areas or piloting areas, showing that, okay, for this area we will ban polluting cars, we'll only have, as I mentioned, these modes, and then people will get used to it. Maybe also do a testing phase. Maybe this also has happened in many cities worldwide. Maybe do 2 or 3 months, half a year of testing phase where you show this is a pilot. We'll ban cars maybe from this district or from these roads, and let people see how it feels and how the benefits are. If there's more space on the road, maybe you have cafes or food stalls there. Maybe get some greeneries in there as well, to make it to create this atmosphere and to really show the benefits. This can be very, very useful, because I think most of us, we've got our habits, we're used to it, to seeing it like that way. And if we pilot changes, this can also be done with, for example, cycling routes, closing roads or parts of roads to enable cycling in a specific route, and pilot this during a couple of months. This can be very, very helpful, because it shows people what can be done, and shows that solution is better than being maybe stuck in traffic in the car. So this I would definitely recommend. There are many things that have been going on in, for example, Europe in this case, or zero emission zones are quite popular, or being introduced in China as well, for example, for EVs, and so on. I think this is one of my favorite measures, because I think technology and planning, it can be done. It's maybe a question of investment and time as well, but this mindset change, showing people, hey, climate change or decarbonization doesn't mean you'll be worse off. It also means you'll have a better quality of life in the end run, right?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I agree. I mean, I think even in Gurgaon, Rahagiri Foundation work on creating a lot of trials where we sort of make the streets or sidewalks safer for pedestrians. You see a lot more of them walking there, or creating a cycle path, or even a cycle counter where it shows you how many cyclists are actually passing through. And I think it's interesting, because if you create something for cyclists, like let's say a cycle path where it didn't exist earlier, you'll see more cyclists. There are, especially here, there's a lack of safety, there's a lack of feeling like you can cycle without, a fear of an accident, or there's just no space set up for cyclists here. So running these kinds of trials can be so positive, because then you can see the demand. It's this concept of induced demand, right? Which is, once you create the infrastructure, people will demand it more. If you give more space to cars, the congestion will not decrease, because more people will get in their cars, and vice versa. If you give more space to the people, if you give more space to sustainable modes of transport, people will use it more. So I think that's definitely an interesting point.
Maybe also adding to this, I think it's a very valid point. So instead of just adding another lane to the highway, maybe add the cycle path, and you'll get some people onto that path. Or add maybe a metro line. Of course, that's more investment, or BRT, a bus line, instead of adding this lane, right? Because adding lanes, it will just incite people to just get more cars. And on the way here, of course, very impressive. Also, I saw the project that's been planned here on the road, like also a pilot project showing how you can integrate cycle paths and make maybe roads more sustainable and friendly for other modes of transport. And I saw actually on the way here a guy on the motorway cycling as well, in between all the big cars. So I mean, the demand is there, and I respect this guy a lot, because it's not a safe thing. And that's the other point, huh? We've got users, cyclists, a lot in India, and we need to kind of protect them as well, right? Mm-hmm. And the topic isn't only in India. In Germany, we've got the same. We've got cycle path. We've probably got a safer infrastructure for cyclists, but still, it's not 100% safe, and we still prioritize vehicles, so cars on the roads, and not cyclists. So it's not only I want to mention this again, it's not only India that has problems, it's everywhere basically. Also in the Netherlands, it's not perfect. They can still advance. And other countries such as Vietnam and China have similar issues, yeah.
That's an interesting point. So, but I think so. What was interesting was we interviewed many cyclists around the city, asking them certain questions: how much do you cycle every day? Where do you cycle from? All of that. But when we actually got to asking them, how do you feel our roads are for cyclists? When we spoke to people who, let's say, cycle in the morning or before work or something like that, not for commute, they said it's very unsafe and we don't usually feel safe. But when we talk to who we call the livelihood cyclists, which is people who have to travel for work every day, they said, we don't have any problem, The roads are there, we use them, we don't think they're unsafe, So I think that demand, it should be there, but people, we've never seen it. We've never seen what the infrastructure could be. And so people don't think that there's anything wrong. So I think creating that demand, I mean, like you said, Germany is not perfect and Netherlands is not perfect. I guess I just want to ask, when there are spaces where it's not perfect, is there generally a demand to improve them, or are there spaces which just stay not perfect?
That's a good question. I think everything is evolving, and I think maybe an example, I don't know if it's a cultural difference or a mindset difference. So in Germany, we have the reputation that we're always demanding. Even if it's close to perfection, people will complain or raise their complaints to the people in power that this has to change. And I think on the one side, it makes us maybe a bit or seen as, let's say, crybabies, but on the other hand, this raises a standard. So if you're a person saying, okay, safety is okay, I won't complain, it is what it is, the standards won't improve. So if you try complaining and raising your issue to authorities that might be able to change it, there can be more change done, right? So I think that's one important part as well. So I wouldn't say everywhere is perfect or anywhere is perfect. There are always things to improve. And for that case, I don't know if I answered your question completely, but that was the first thing that sprung to my mind, that we have to demand change as well. So don't accept the current conditions. And regarding safety, I think the interesting thing you mentioned, that a cyclist you interviewed said it's fine like this. I think the major issue might be also more systemic, that it's not only cyclists in danger. If I see my experience, I've been in India now a couple of months through my lifetime. It's the walkers. If I'm walking, I'm in danger also on the roads. If I'm a cyclist, I'm in danger. If I take an auto, I'm also in danger. It always goes on. Maybe it depends also on the mentality and the vehicle size, right? So car drivers are also in danger because traffic might not be as regulated or as protective, or traffic systems, or the traffic, how would you call it, just the way the traffic flows, or the unwritten rules of traffic, let's say, aren't friendly to smaller, more vulnerable groups in the system, right? Maybe a big lorry, he will be relatively safe because you know where I'm getting, right? Yes. So this might be also one of the triggers that need to be worked on. I don't know how, because similar in Germany, as I mentioned, or similarly around the world. I mean, you won't, as a walking person, cycling person, or on two-wheelers, you will be at the very bottom of the food chain in the transport, unwritten rules of transport systems. So this is something that also needs to be changed. And how can you do it? Of course, by protecting these users, right? Through cycle paths, zebra crossings that are really enforced, traffic lights, and so on, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you're completely right, which is, if it is systemic, which it seems like it is, then if you are always in danger as a vulnerable user, you don't know if it's dangerous or not. If it's always dangerous, then maybe it seems like the norm and you don't know how it can be improved. So I think that is what we are trying to do. So as you said, the road that you crossed while coming in here, we are trying to use that as a model street for Gurgaon, right? Which is creating a street where there is a walking path, a cycle path, and space for cars, and space for, benches, and like beautifying the areas, putting more greenery, more trees. You won't see a street designed like that with all of these elements on them anywhere in India, basically, right? But our idea is if we can create a model for Gurgaon, then maybe other parts of Gurgaon will adopt it, and then hopefully other cities will see that Gurgaon's roads are becoming safer, and that hopefully then, they will adopt it. And then again, it'll be gradual, but hopefully we can move closer and closer to cities that at least try to prioritize the vulnerable road users, because they are the vulnerable road users. They need them, they require the most protection.
Definitely. So I wish you best of luck. I think it's a great pilot and a great initiative to show how it can be done, and not only talk about it, but really implement pilot projects is really critical. Yeah.
We're nearing the end of this podcast, but there's always a question we ask at the end, which is, as it's called the Pave the Way podcast, how do we pave the way forward? And I think we've basically discussed that throughout this conversation. So I think we have emission goals by 2030 for many different countries. Even, as a planet in general, we are trying to reduce emissions by, let's say, 50% by 2030, or at least India has that goal. Do you see that happening? Do you think we are moving in the right direction towards achieving our emission goals, our sustainable mobility goals? And are you positive about the future?
I'm definitely positive about the future. I would say an optimist. But right now what we see worldwide is that change is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. We've got targets, so our global target is 2050, of course.
2050, yes.
To stay below this 1.5 degrees Celsius mark. But there are many challenges still. So I think even like the industrialized or the leading countries in the world are doing change, but it's not enough for the moment. So what we are, of course, I think the most difficult thing is to get moving. So it took us years and years globally to get moving and taking climate change serious and starting to have other ideas. But I think this tipping point, from my perspective, has been reached. So there's more awareness, but there's still a lot of people or initiatives or lobbies holding us back, right? So I think I'm positive that we'll get there, but we need like these scale effects to really kick in soon. So I think there's a lot of work to be done still, and a lot of awareness to be raised. But my positiveness comes from that direction, that I think the scale effects will kick in. We call it the hockey stick, basically. So it's difficult to get this change going, but once you've implemented it and shown that it's possible to do, for example, with the EV transition, right? It was very, very difficult to get EVs onto the market, to get the automotive industry to shift and get charging infrastructure on the road. But once you get this tipping point and start increasing numbers, then the scale effect will show that the transition is possible. And I think it's with most of the things we do or try to target for 2050, that's the way forward. But in some areas, my example was EVs. I think we've come to a tipping point in the main, let's say, leading nations in this area. Let's say United States, Europe, China. And I think India, a lot is happening as well. But for other topics such as 15-minute cities, cycling-friendly cities, and so on, I don't think this tipping point has happened yet, because we haven't been able to show, hey, if we take you away from privately owned vehicles to cycling and walking, your life will be better. I think most of the people aren't aware of this yet, or haven't been shown the solution yet. So, for example, through your road, that's going to happen here. You will show it, and hopefully, but this needs to really scale up and get there until 2050. Let's see. But I think a lot of more work is required, and happy to be part of it. So to say, and give my best.
I think all the experts and individuals in the mobility space I've spoken to with asking this specific question, the answers are somewhat the same, which is there's a lot of work to do. There are challenges to address, but everyone said that they were optimistic and they do feel positive. And I think it is a wonderful thing that the people that are working towards it remain optimistic, because without that, then, if there isn't the hope and the optimism that it will work out, then, maybe you start to lose hope, which is not a good thing.
Yeah, sure. And maybe adding one thing, I know we're running out of time, but we've actually done an analysis in my project on this. It's called the Path to Zero.
For the listeners, the Path to Zero, a vision for decarbonized transport in Asia.
Yeah.
So do check it out.
Check it out and give us feedback. Yeah, if you've got any interesting ideas also to add, would be great. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. I think this has been an enlightening conversation for me, and there will be lessons to be learned for all of our listeners. And yeah, it's just been a pleasure having you on.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. Yeah.
Thank you so much.